Confrontation to correction. When Jasmine Crockett flipped the script, the lights were hot. The air in the studio felt thick with tension, like it always does when something big is about to happen, even if nobody says it out loud. It was just another political panel discussion, the kind where guests talk over each other about policy and blame. But tonight carried a different weight. The topic, criminal justice reform. The lineup, a powder keg. On the left sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense presence. On the right, Attorney General Pam Bondi of Florida, a fixture in conservative legal circles. Two strong women with opposing views on national television. You could almost hear producers rubbing their hands backstage. Jasmine remained calm, carrying that focused energy that makes people underestimate you because you're not raising your voice. Her team had warned her to expect heat, maybe even disrespect, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse in courtrooms. Bondi wore confidence like armor. She entered smiling but stiff, scanning the room like she was taking inventory. You could tell she was ready for a show, not a conversation. The segment began with a soft question to Bondi about sentencing disparities in Florida. She gave a rehearsed answer, polished for middle America, law and order, individual responsibility, a culture of leniency. No one interrupted. Then the moderator turned to Crockett, asking about bias in the justice system. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her voice low and direct. She spoke about data and real numbers, how black defendants received longer sentences than white defendants for identical crimes in the same counties, how cash bail kept poor people behind bars while those with money walked free. Facts were her fuel. Just as she built to her point, Bondi cut in. No disrespect, Congresswoman, but that's just not true, she said, waving her hand dismissively. You're cherry-picking stats and ignoring the real causes of crime in our communities. The moderator tried to intervene, but Bondi continued. People are tired of this narrative, tired of blaming the system. Maybe it's time we start talking about accountability. The studio fell quiet. Crockett's face didn't move, not a blink, not a twitch. Bondi smiled, probably thinking she'd landed a solid punch. Let's allow Congresswoman Crockett to respond, the moderator said, clearing his throat. Jasmine adjusted her MIC, not because it needed fixing, but because it bought her half a second to gather thoughts she didn't really need time to collect. She'd been here before, in rooms where people in power tried to paint her as emotional, irrational, unqualified. Let me be very clear, she said, her voice calm and clipped. What I said wasn't theory. It wasn't opinion. It came directly from Department of Justice data, sentencing project studies, and court records. If we're going to have this conversation, we can't start by pretending reality doesn't exist. Bondi blinked, perhaps surprised that Jasmine didn't get defensive. You say people are tired of this narrative, Jasmine continued. But the only people who seem tired of it are the ones who never had to live it. There was a brief pause, the kind that rarely happens on TV. You talk about accountability. I'm all for accountability, she said. So, let's start with the police departments that don't report use of force data. The prosecutors who push plea deals on innocent people to pad conviction rates. The judges who sentence kids like adults because their zip code doesn't look like yours. Bondi shifted in her chair, her smile fading slightly. But she wasn't backing down. With all due respect, Congresswomen, she interrupted, sharper this time, I've spent my career locking up criminals who destroy their own neighborhoods. If you want to talk about justice, start there. It was a strategic move. Blame the community. Make it about morality. Frame yourself as the adult in the room. A tactic as old as politics. Jasmine didn't take the bait. What you just said is exactly the problem, she replied. You talk about locking people up, but you never talk about what they were locked out of before they ever broke the law. You focus on punishment, but you never mention prevention. You measure justice by jail cells, not by opportunities. Bondi tried to respond, but this time the moderator stepped in. Let's stay on topic, please. Too late. The audience, both in the studio and at home, had already picked up on the energy shift. Bondi came in trying to dominate. Crockett wasn't playing defense. She was rewriting the rules. You can't fix a system if you refuse to admit it's broken, Jasmine said, turning to the camera now. And you definitely can't lead on justice if you think acknowledging racism is the same as being divisive. A few gasps, a few murmurs. You could see one of the producers behind the glass drop his pen. Bondi, for the first time, didn't speak. Her lips parted slightly like she was preparing to say something but then didn't. The remarkable thing was that Crockett never raised her voice, never broke her rhythm. And somehow that made everything she said land harder. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to be heard. A subtle stillness filled the studio, that in-between moment when people are still processing what they just heard. Bondi had leaned back slightly, her usual armor of smooth delivery and sharp interruptions no longer effective. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, glancing offstage at a producer or staffer, searching for control that was no longer in the room. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat motionless. She wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking. She knew better than to celebrate too early. These moments are slippery. One misstep, one misplaced tone, and the narrative shifts. The moderator, sensing tension that could either explode or evaporate, redirected. Let's shift gears. Attorney General Bondi, how do you respond to critics who say your office has consistently resisted efforts to increase transparency in sentencing? Pam forced a quick smile. That's simply false. Our office has been very open to reform, real reform, not political grandstanding. But we're not going to sacrifice public safety for optics. It was a practiced answer, firm and clean, but the moment had already drifted from her. The audience wasn't leaning forward when she spoke anymore. They were waiting for Jasmine's next words. Crockett didn't jump in. She waited. Let Bondi finish. Let the silence hang for a second. And then, softly, not accusing, not dramatic, she asked, "What exactly do you mean by real reform?" Bondi blinked. Well, for starters, we're supporting data sharing across jurisdictions. We've expanded our youth diversion programs. Programs your office only supported after public pressure and 2 investigative reports. Jasmine cut in politely but firmly. There it was again, a pinpointed correction. Crockett wasn't throwing haymakers. She was slicing fact after fact, contradiction after contradiction. Bondi exhaled, not quite a sigh, but close. You know what I think? I think people like you are more focused on the narrative than the solution. It was meant to flip the script. Paint Crockett as a politician, the idealist, someone who talked a lot but didn't solve much. Jasmine smiled, not to be liked, but to signal that she saw the move coming. I care about the solution, she said. I just don't believe in solving the wrong problem. Then she shifted forward slightly, as if talking directly to the audience. You want to know what real reform looks like? It looks like a system where zip codes don't predict outcomes, where prosecutors don't treat public defenders like speed bumps, where a public defender doesn't carry a caseload of 150 people and still sleeps at night wondering who they failed. She paused. Where judges can't justify longer sentences because someone looks like they'll reoffend when all they are really doing is judging fear, not facts. The audience was still, not out of awkwardness this time, but attention. And real reform, she added, means you don't silence the people closest to the problem just because they make you uncomfortable. Jasmine let the pause stretch just a second longer than expected, then turned directly toward Pam Bondi, not with anger or mockery, just intent, like someone who'd grown tired of walking around the edges of truth. You know, there's something personal in the way you speak about communities like mine. Bondi's expression hardened. She wasn't used to being addressed this directly, not on air. You keep referring to neighborhoods destroyed by crime, Jasmine continued. But never once have you acknowledged what created those conditions to begin with: redlining, underfunded schools, over-policing, predatory lending. You want to talk about law and order, but skip the history that broke the order in the first place. Pam leaned forward, her voice tightening. I've spent years working with law enforcement to bring down crime rates. I'm not here to get lectured about ancient policies that have nothing to do with today's problems. Jasmine blinked. Her voice was lower now, measured. You think redlining is ancient? The last redline loan maps weren't phased out until the late 80s. You think systemic bias is old news? Your own office opposed a data collection bill on racial disparities in traffic stops last year. That caught Bondi off guard. She sat back, her jaw moved slightly, searching for a rebuttal. You called it bureaucratic overreach, Jasmine added. But let me translate that for the people watching at home. You didn't want to look. The studio air changed again. Viewers across the country were glued to their screens now, not for spectacle, but for something rarer, directness without drama. I stand by the work my office has done to keep families safe. Bondi tried once more. You think safety only means more prisons? Jasmine replied, I think safety means a parent doesn't have to choose between paying rent and posting bail. Safety means a teenager doesn't have to grow up thinking a routine stop could turn deadly. Safety means justice doesn't look different depending on what you can afford. Pam's face was still, perhaps realizing that every word she said was becoming part of a narrative she didn't control. I've sat with mothers who never got a call back after their son was arrested, Jasmine continued. I've worked on cases where evidence sat on a desk because the defendant had no lawyer to push the system forward. You don't see that from your office. You only see numbers, charts, crime rates. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, just a steady, rhythmic stream of truth wrapped in real-life stories that couldn't be brushed aside. Well, I think we both want the same thing, Bondi said, her voice softened, almost unsure. Safer communities, stronger institutions. Wanting the same thing doesn't mean we're doing the same work, Jasmine responded. Intentions are fine, but what matters is impact. That landed hard. A beat passed. Even those in the audience who'd come in skeptical weren't checking their watches. They were watching a woman push through the noise, the interruptions, the polished political gloss, and speak with something harder to challenge, lived experience paired with receipts. Do you remember the case of Alonzo Brewer? Jasmine asked. Pam hesitated. You should. He spent 12 months in pretrial detention because he couldn't afford bond. Your prosecutors pushed for max sentencing on a minor possession charge. His public defender filed 5 motions to expedite the case. No response. Pam looked confused, perhaps trying to remember if someone had prepped her on this. He took a plea deal, Jasmine added. Didn't even know he had a legal right to see the body cam footage. The audience was silent. Bondi's face tightened. That was your office. That was your policy. For the first time in the entire broadcast, Pam Bondi didn't know what to say. She sat back, fingers lightly tapping her stack of notes. The talking points she'd rehearsed were miles away from the ground she now stood on. The name Alonzo Brewer had done something. It wasn't just a case. It was a face, a real one, a story with blood, time, and mistakes tied to her office. Bondi wasn't used to people bringing those stories into public airspace like this. Attorney General Bondi, would you like to respond? The moderator asked cautiously. Pam cleared her throat. I'm not familiar with that specific case, but I'll be sure to look into it. Jasmine raised one eyebrow, not in judgment, but in disbelief. He wrote your office 4 times. His sister called your desk personally twice. His file sat untouched for 3 months before it even got logged into the system. Across the country, social media lit up. Clips of the exchange were already being posted with captions like, "She came with the files, and this is what accountability looks like." I take these matters seriously, Bondi said, and I understand that justice isn't always perfect, but I also know that we need to support our prosecutors and law enforcement officers who work hard under difficult conditions. Jasmine leaned forward, voice softer now. And I know good officers, too. I've stood next to them. But when we talk about justice, it can't just be about defending the system. It has to be about fixing it when it fails. There was a pause. Then Crockett added something unexpected. I don't want to fight you. I want to work with you. But I can't do that if your first instinct is to dismiss the realities I spent my life trying to change. Pam didn't speak. Maybe she didn't know how to respond. Maybe she knew there wasn't a clean answer. That silence said more than words ever could. The segment was supposed to last 15 minutes, but it had gone far past that, and nobody wanted it to stop. We'll take a quick break and return in a moment, the moderator finally said. The screen faded to black, but in living rooms across the country, people were already picking sides. Yet no one could deny it. Something had shifted in that room, and it was bigger than either of them. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were everywhere. People weren't just watching once. They were rewinding to Jasmine's response to Bondi's interruption, replaying the moment Bondi's expression changed when Alonzo Brewer's name came up. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a mirror, a flash of clarity in a country exhausted from noise and distractions. Here was a woman, black, bold, relentless, walking into a room designed to shrink her and refusing to do so. Not with volume, not with anger, but with truth. Crockett didn't check her phone right away after the taping. She stayed in the green room with her chief of staff, who sat across from her, quietly shaking her head. "You knew she'd come for you," her staffer said. "I was counting on it," Jasmine replied. Bondi left the studio quickly. Her communications director was already drafting a statement, something neutral, something safe. But no statement would shift what had just aired. People had seen too much. At a diner outside Columbus, Ohio, two women in their 60s watched a rerun on a mounted screen. One said, "She didn't even yell. She just laid it out like a case file." The other sipped her coffee, then replied, "That's how you know she was right." In a community center in Bakersfield, teenagers sat with their youth mentor, rewatching the clip. "She's the kind of leader I want to be," one girl whispered. That night, cable news broke down the panel from every angle. Some hosts called Crockett a force to watch. Others criticized her for being confrontational. But even critics admitted she didn't just hold her ground. She took the ground and redrew the map. By morning, she was trending not because of theatrics, but because of something rarer, substance. One user wrote, "It's not often someone gets attacked on live TV and walks out looking like the adult in the room." Jasmine Crockett didn't clap back. She taught a masterclass. Jasmine's first post that day was just one sentence: "Facts are not attacks." Later that week, she held a town hall in San Bernardino. No frills, just folding chairs and people. She listened more than she spoke. When someone asked how it felt to confront Bondi on national television, she said it wasn't about confrontation. It was about correction. Some things just can't go unchecked anymore. The room fell quiet. People nodded because whether you agreed with her or not, it was hard to argue with what she stood for: accountability without fear, truth without performance, grace under pressure, and knowing when to speak and when to let silence finish the work. The conversation hadn't died down days later. If anything, it had deepened. What happened wasn't just a clash between public figures. It peeled back the layers of how public trust is earned and how easily it can be shaken. That's why Jasmine didn't bask in the attention. She stayed on schedule, committee meetings, field visits, private calls with families dealing with the very legal system she criticized on air. The clip kept spreading, over 4 million views on one channel alone. A surprising number of comments came from people who admitted they didn't agree with her politics but respected how she carried herself. When she gave a talk at Southern University the following week, she took a different tone, more intimate, less fire, more focus. "We have to stop acting like justice is a one-size-fits-all promise," she told the students. Because for too many folks in this country, that promise was never meant to fit them in the first place. She looked around the room. It's not enough to say the right thing on camera. It's what you fight for when nobody's looking that counts. Pam Bondi never issued a direct response, just a press release about miscommunication and respectful dialogue. By then, the public had already decided whose voice echoed loudest. Because when someone comes at you with interruption and disrespect, it's easy to snap back. But it's something else entirely to hold your ground with facts, patience, and the kind of calm that rattles people because it won't be moved. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that power doesn't always speak the loudest. Sometimes it speaks in questions that make people uncomfortable, in names that would have been forgotten, in silences that follow hard truths. So if you ever find yourself doubted, interrupted, or underestimated, remember this: preparation beats provocation. When you walk into a room ready not to argue but to correct, you don't need to shout. You just need to speak and let the facts do the rest. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell.